Om Purnamidam Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vasishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, that Brahman is infinite. This phenomenal world is infinite. But this is only a projection of that. Nevertheless, if this is taken away, that remains infinite as before. Om, peace to the individuals, peace to the planets, and peace to the animals. So we're studying Ishu Upanishad, and first we'll read the verses we've covered already. So in this changing world, everything is subject to change. Yet everything is covered by the Lord. Practice renunciation and be strong in the consciousness of the self. Do not run after anyone's wealth. A man may wish to live for 100 years performing his duties as prescribed by the scriptures. O man, if you do your duties in this way, then the results of whatever you do will not cling to you. There is no other way. There are worlds known to be sunless and fit for demons. They are enveloped in darkness, such as with the blind, in other words, those devoid of self-knowledge and experience. Those people who have neglected the attainment of self-knowledge and have thus committed suicide, as it were, are doomed to enter those worlds after death. Brahman is one without a second. It never moves, yet it goes faster than the mind. It is always ahead. The sense organs can never catch up with it. It is still, yet it defeats all in a race. By its power, the Lord who dwells in space upholds water and everything else in the phenomenal world. That Brahman moves, and it does not move. It is far off, and it is also nearby. That Brahman is inside of this and is also its outside. He who sees everything in himself and himself in everything never hates anything. When a person knows that he himself has become everything, and he knows the oneness of things, how can he hate or love anything? He, the self, is all-pervasive, radiant, without a form, without any defect, immaculate, untainted, all-knowing, the master of his own mind, the best of all, of independent origin and eternal. He dispenses to each his due. Those who mechanically perform sacrifices, avidya, go into a darkness that is like being blind. But those who merely worship gods and goddesses, avidya, go into a deeper darkness. Scholars say that the path of avidya, performing Agnihotra and other sacrifices, and the path of vidya, worshipping gods and goddesses, produce different results. Wise men confirm this. He who worships gods and goddesses, avidya, and also performs sacrifices, avidya, attains immortality by sacrifices, avidya, and attains bliss by worshipping gods and goddesses, avidya. Those who worship the unmanifested, the causal state of the world, go into a darkness that is like being blind. But those who worship the manifested, the world we see around us, go into a deeper darkness. Scholars say that the worship of Sambhuti, Hiranyagarbha, and Asambhuti, Prakriti, produce different results, and wise men confirm this. He who worships the unmanifested, Asambhuti, and also the manifested, Sambhuti, attains immortality by the unmanifested, Asambhuti, and conquers death by the manifested, Sambhuti. So these are the verses 14 verses we covered so far. There's only, I think, 18 altogether. Yeah, 18 verses altogether, so we're almost at the end now. So as you can see, the basic teaching of Vedanta, the Upanishads, and especially the teaching of the Isha Upanishad, is that there's one consciousness there. There's one divine, eternal, infinite consciousness out of which everything else has come. Just as with our own mind, our own imagination, we can create a world, we can picture ourselves in China, we can create all kinds of things, encompass the whole universe within our mind just like that. And the same way all of creation comes out of this consciousness, is expressed just like that. It doesn't require obstacles or things, overcoming obstacles. In this world, at the physical level, everything we do involves obstacles. Everything we want to do involves work, it involves doing something. If we want to know what's happening in India, we have to get on a plane, we have to spend 24 hours on flying, and eventually we go to India and then we have to look around and see what's going on. Whereas in the mind, you can just picture things right away. There's no hesitation. So the idea is that when the universe was created, when God created the universe, He was just done. It's called, in Christian theology, it's called fiat. Let it be, and it was. There was no, He didn't have to build the planets, He didn't have to do anything, He just said, let it be, and it was. And we talked earlier in some of the verses, how really when you look at creation, you, the scientists are speaking of the Big Bang and all this, and we mentioned that according to Vedanta, according to the Hindu teachings, that in the beginning there was universal superior pralaya, dissolution, not non-expression, not manifestation. And everything, meaning particularly the three gunas, they were all in equilibrium. So it was like a big lake, everything was calm, serene, not a single ripple, nothing, everything was steady. And then creation starts, we said like Brahma, the creator, he took a rock and he then threw it into the lake. And then everything else starts to happen. You get all the ripples, waves, everything taking shape. And it's interesting that this is very close to what many of the scientists are saying, that cosmologists who are studying the universe, who come up with very Vedantic ideas about creation and about the universe. And I mentioned a few classes ago how once I was listening, I saw on TV there were scientists talking about these ideas, talking about creation. And he said, that we had the Big Bang, but he said as close as they could figure out, and I think that everything was what he said was called a singularity. And everything was in equilibrium. In other words, everything was all just one thing, all in equilibrium. And then he said something happened to disturb that equilibrium. And then all the universe came out. And this is very close to almost exactly what the Vedantic idea is. And also in Vedanta, Hinduism, they believe that creation is a cyclical process. It comes again, it comes again. When the universe comes into expression, then it goes back into pralaya, into dissolution. It's called the day of Brahma, and then it comes back to the night of Brahma. And then again, another universe comes out. And again, the scientists, based on it's everything, they get all these ideas based on mathematics and things. But the scientists are saying that if the mass of the universe is at a certain level, then what will happen is the universe will expand up to a certain point, and then it will all begin to draw back inside, eventually get back to the singularity, and then again explode out into another universe. So it's in the West, there was a big conflict between science and religion. Because religion, at that time predominantly Christian religion, was thinking primarily in terms of the Bible and what the theology, the doctrines and things were, and saying that any truth had to be in line with what the theology was, what the dogmas and doctrines were. On the other hand, in Vedanta, they believe that truth is truth. There's a higher truth and a lower truth. There's Paravidya, the supreme knowledge, which is the knowledge of Brahman, of the ultimate reality, the spiritual knowledge. But then there's Aparavidya, and which is all your secondary knowledge, which includes science and all the different arts and everything, all the human knowledge, the things you learn in college. And it also includes scriptural study. In other words, when a person learns Sanskrit, when he studies the scriptures, when he learns the scriptures, when he writes books about the scriptures, that's all Aparavidya. Paravidya, the supreme knowledge, is something that comes within, that's revealed from within your own deeper consciousness and brings with it its own kind of unfolding reality, truth. And so merely having intellectual ideas or reading books or studying about the truth is not the same as what's called Brahmavidya. It's the actual spiritual knowledge. There's a famous Zen saying that the finger is not the moon. You use the finger, you point and say the moon's over there. And this is what the scriptures do. They point and they say this is the truth over here. But it's not the same thing as the truth itself. In other words, knowing what the scriptures say, knowing and believing, saying yes, I believe in that, that's true, is not the same as realizing it. And this is the core of all Vedanta, of all Hinduism, as well as the spiritual teachings in all the religions, is that God, the ultimate reality, is something that needs to be experienced, something that needs to be an actual conscious experience, and it can be. And this is what all the spiritual practices, meditation, everything like that, is trying to bring us to the point where this ultimate reality, the supreme reality out of which the whole universe, everything's got, where that becomes our own conscious experience, becomes real for us. And then, then you understand what the real value of religion and spiritual life is. So this is all here. Like I said, it's the idea is that you have both the manifested universe, what he talks about here, the self-oriented manifested universe is the universe we experience, the universe we see, people and things and houses and cities. The unmanifested universe, the causal universe, is at a more subtle level that we don't see, we're not aware of normally, but yet out of it comes the manifested universe. It's what the mystics say, the spiritual people say, is that what we experience as the real world is actually the result of forces that are operating at a more subtle level. We see the results of it. We see the people and things and activities going on here, but we don't know the why of it, where it came from. And for example, you have the idea that you've got an acorn. Now that acorn is buried in the ground, but for some reason, it begins to gradually sprout and grow, and eventually it becomes a big oak tree. So we see the oak tree, but we don't see what the life force is that caused all of this to happen, that caused it to take shape and become an oak tree. And so the causal universe that they talk about, or the unmanifested, this is the underlying kind of invisible causes that produce everything that we're experiencing here. We tend to think, for the most part, that this world, the world is manifested that we see and experience every day, that this is reality. And then we think anything else was kind of a vague, unreal, imaginary type of thing. But actually, the real forces of creation are not here. They're not at this level. They are at a more subtle level and expressing themselves here. And we used the example before, how you look at somebody building a house, and you see the workers and they're sawing wood and hammering and doing things, and working very hard. And you see, because of these workers are doing so much physical labor, because they're working so hard, this is what created the house. But actually, if you go a step back, you realize that the creative source of the house was not all this hard physical labor that was being done. It was an idea in the mind of the architect. The physical labor, the physical part, is just a working out of something that was at the mental level as an idea. In the same way, behind the mental level of ideas, there's even a kind of more subtle causes there, gradually, eventually getting all the way back to divine, to God Himself. Starting at God, working its way down through grosser and grosser levels, and eventually expressing at this level. But both of these, there's a great point, both of these, the manifested universe that we experience, the physical universe we experience, and also even the underlying causal universe, the deeper, the kind of more subtle forces that are there. Neither of these is the goal of Vedanta. Because beyond all this, beyond the entire universe, beyond all these cosmic forces, everything else, gods and goddesses and everything, is the self. And by self is meant that original consciousness which each and every one of us actually is. And that self, that consciousness, is one with Brahman and is the source out of which everything comes. Now this is a very hard idea to grasp because it's something that is much different than our ordinary idea of consciousness. Usually when we speak of consciousness, we say, okay, I'm conscious, I'm aware, I'm awake, I'm aware of what's going on, and so forth. And I'm conscious because I'm a body. This body, because this body's here, I'm conscious and I'm me, and I have a sense that I exist. But the actual fact is that you exist because of consciousness. And that consciousness has then taken on a body and a mind as instruments by which it can experience this world, by which it can see this world, interact with the world, enjoy things, do things that through this body and mind we are able to be human beings, to be in this world. But if you go deeper and begin to ask, well, who am I really? What am I really? You eventually discover that the thing in you which is saying, I exist, this is me, I'm alive, I'm aware, I'm awake, that thing within you is actually something different than the body or the mind, and something much vaster. And this is the gist of all the spiritual teachers, teachings in Vedanta, is that in ancient times, there were people in India called the rishis, the sages, who went into the forest, they looked deep within their own inner self, their own inner consciousness, and they discovered that behind the world that we experience in our everyday life, there's a spiritual reality there. And that is based upon the idea of the one consciousness. Now, what makes this so difficult and so abstract for most people, so hard to understand, is that when we're speaking of this consciousness, we're not speaking of our personal consciousness. Our personal consciousness is consciousness that's connected with a particular body and this particular mind and personality and this particular ego. This says that I'm this individual here. So right now, each one of us, we're sitting here, each one of us, we're conscious, we're aware, but each one of us feels, I'm this person here and I'm different than every other person in the room. And so this gives us our sense that I'm this individual. And normally, this is where our idea of who we are comes from. Our physical body and our personality. and our whole memories and experiences and things. But as you go deeper, when you get back to the true consciousness, which you are, to what you really are, which is they refer to as the self, the real self of what you are, that consciousness is not that particular person, it is just consciousness. It's that person, but it's also everything else, because there's only the one consciousness there. It's like each and every individual is a particular individualized consciousness having particular individual experiences, leading a particular life. Now when you begin to go deeper into the spiritual part of things, you discover that you start to get into a consciousness which is kind of higher than your individual consciousness, and you begin to realize that, oh, this is the consciousness within everybody else. So this is back in ancient times, these rishis, these sages, they discovered. First of all, they discovered that each individual is an immortal, eternal, spiritual being. And this they call the Atman, means self. Then they also discovered that behind the whole universe, there's one cosmic, one infinite spiritual consciousness out of which the whole universe has come. And this they call Brahman, or God. But the third important thing they discovered is that there's a unity in things. Everything is an expression of one consciousness. When they speak of self with a capital S, they're talking about the self within everybody. And so, normally in our ordinary state of consciousness, our ordinary experience, we're separate from that oneness. We see, I'm this particular individual, everybody else is different, there's barriers between each and every individual, and this is all we know. And so then we fight with each other, we compete, we struggle, or sometimes we like some people, we don't like others, like that. There's all this interreaction going on. Never realizing that the self in the person I hate, the person I can't stand, that same consciousness, that same self is what's in me. That comes only when you reach kind of a higher consciousness, when you get above the body, beyond body, beyond mind, then you discover there is this consciousness here, and you realize it's not your consciousness. It's not belonging just to you, it's equally belonging to everybody. And so this is then ultimately discovered, that consciousness which you've experienced and which you see is now expanding and including other people, everything, that consciousness is actually Brahman. It's actually God, the source of the whole universe. And that one consciousness is experiencing through all the eyes of the universe, through all the individuals, through all the plants, animals, insects, everything. That one consciousness, that one awareness is experiencing. And but even that is not kind of the ultimate truth, because even though that consciousness is experiencing through all the bodies, all the different instruments in the universe, it is something else in itself. And that's something, they say, is even beyond this universe. They say this whole universe, this whole creation, is like one drop in the ocean of Brahman. It's just a little tiny thing that Brahman is so much beyond that can't be described. Now as I said, what makes this so hard to understand and so uninteresting for most people is the idea that the only way you can reach that is by letting go of your small self. The stronger identification with my particular personal self, the less you're aware of what your real self is, or what your true self is. And this then expresses itself in terms of selfishness. Selfishness means essentially that all of our attention is focused on this one particular individual here, to the exclusion of everybody else. And what it means is actually, through selfishness you contract, you become smaller and smaller. So that your whole universe, your whole consciousness is just what's happening to me, am I getting what I want, and that's all you think about. Now in life, one of the things we're learning in life is to be unselfish, is to gradually learn to grow and to take other people into consideration. We're born kind of basically selfish, and then I remember when we were kids, my mother would bake a cake. And she'd let us cut the cake. So I would cut a great big piece for myself and a little tiny piece for my sister. And then my mother, she came up with, I'm sure, as a universal law of mothers, and said one person got to cut the cake and one person got to pick their piece. So then it worked out. But like that, we go from being totally self-absorbed babies, slowly, totally selfish. We gradually begin to grow and expand and begin to think about other people too. Is this person happy? Usually, it starts with our family, the people we're associated with, our friends, like that. Some people, we just kind of include them in our consciousness, and so our consciousness is actually beginning to expand and grow. And eventually, that expansion begins to reach further out until it begins to include all the universe. And so, for example, it's very good for a parent to love their child. It's very good for a parent to take care of their child. You want their child to be happy. But now suppose a person is king of a country, and yet he harms the country, for the sake of his son. And this you see through history, this happens all the time. Those people who have power, who have a position of power, will often use that power to take care of their own. But a king, or any kind of ruler, has to think in terms of the whole country as a whole. And this is what, so the family life, it gives us an experience of growing, of beginning to expand, but eventually you outgrow that and begin to think in terms of the broader humanity. And eventually this begins to lead you to the point where you begin to think in terms of the one self in all. Swami Vivekananda, I said that the ordinary social experiences we go through, raising families, so what? He said this is like the kindergarten for the soul. That eventually you reach a point where you're realizing that there is this one self. There's the self that's in me, the self which says, is concerned whether I'm happy or unhappy. You realize that this very same self, this very same consciousness is within everybody else. And so then your whole understanding, and particularly your whole consciousness, changes from this one person here, it begins to include everything. Now, most of you're probably too young to remember Anwar Sadat. He was the president of Egypt a long time ago. And anyway, so but he risked his whole political career, he risked everything, and was eventually assassinated in order to try to bring peace to the Middle East. He was the first one of the Arabs to go and meet in Jerusalem with the Israelis and try to achieve some peace in the Middle East. He had great sacrifice. He was under great threats from the other Arab nations. And I said eventually he was assassinated. Now, in his early days, Anwar said, and he was like one of the two kind of noble statesmen you've seen in the world. Now, in his early days, he was a kind of revolutionary. I think there was a King Farouk, and Nasser and others, they kind of eventually overthrew him, but he was involved in an assassination attempt, put into solitary confinement for many months, and during that time, he said he had an experience in which he realized that the self, the consciousness, which was within him, was also within everybody else. And out of that insight, out of that light, he came out and was willing to sacrifice his own interests, his own political career, his own life, everything, in order to do what was good for the majority. Because he had glimpsed that behind all the individuals is this one consciousness, and that's who I really am. And that's who everybody else is. So it's moving, in spiritual life you're moving from complete isolation, from complete separation from everything else, everybody else in the world, every other thing, and moving towards being in harmony, having a sense that I'm part of this universe, that I'm part of everything. Slowly growing into that so that your personal self, your personal interests tend to be forgotten as you begin to focus on the underlying unity that's there and begin to operate out of that unity. And it's actually possible, this is what the saints and the sages and everybody have done, to actually have that as your sense of identity. Rather than I'm this person and everything that all of my concerns are what's happening to this person, you begin to focus on that higher consciousness and begin to then operate in connection with it. And this is like the basis of spiritual life, really. Everything is not my will, but thy will be done. And there's two ways to approach this. One is for the jnani, who follow the path of knowledge, that he studies his scriptures, he hears this truth, that you're really Atman, you're really spirit, you're really one with this consciousness, and he tries to take on that identity. Yes, I'm one with that consciousness, but in order to take on that identity, he's saying, I'm not the body, I'm not the mind, I'm not this, what's going on in my daily life, I am this universal, immortal consciousness. And it's very difficult for the average person to kind of think in those terms. Now there's another approach to that same truth, which is known as Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion. In this path, the individual says, okay, I'm this human being, I'm so-and-so, and this is what I feel myself to be, this is what I seem to be. But yet I sense that within me, deep within me, there's something greater than me. There's something more wonderful than me. There's greater power that can look after me, that can protect me, that can take care of me, guide me. And slowly I try to build up a relationship with that greater thing. And eventually you move towards it so that it becomes in time an actual experience. That as you meditate, as you sit, you begin to get glimpses that there's actually something there. At first, meditation, it tends to be kind of a mental practice, mental gymnastics. You're just trying to repeat a mantra or focus on something, and it's just a mental kind of practice. But eventually, there comes a moment when you catch a glimpse of something else that's there. And that something is very wonderful. It brings with it a sense of peace, a sense of everything being all right, and a sense that it's something real. And this then draws the person kind of deeper and deeper until he shifts consciousness from that all the focus on the individual here, the human being, to focus on this deeper consciousness, and eventually, ultimately, becomes one with that consciousness. So that now, his sense of identity is not, I'm this body here, is I'm that one universal consciousness. This is who I am, this is what I am. And along that whole way, this is what's called the spiritual path, or the spiritual journey. And this is what we're actually trying to do here in the world, is trying to make that journey. That in every life, we're slowly trying to move towards that direction, back to knowing who we really are, what we really are. And then, as Christ said in the Bible, you shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free. As soon as we begin to glimpse this higher aspect of things, then you begin to experience the kind of the bliss and the joy and the kind of glory of your own true self. Now the important thing to remember, regardless of what path you're on, the important thing to remember about this is that God, the ultimate reality, is not something far away. Most people, at least in the West, most people would tend to think that God is off in heaven somewhere, that he's up, beyond the clouds and beyond the planets, somewhere, running the universe, and very hard to get to. But in fact, God is closer to us than anything else, because He's our own true self. That as we approach the divine, you begin to find there a kind of a love, an acceptance, a power that is beyond anything you can experience in ordinary life. In our ordinary relationships, we may love some people, but always there's kind of barriers there. There's separation. But as you move towards God, you're moving into oneness with everything. And then there's no longer barriers. There's no longer friction. And because it's all the one self expressing itself, and there's kind of nothing higher than realizing that and becoming a part of it, becoming aware of it. So as Swami Vivekananda said that selfishness is contraction and contraction is death, he said unselfishness is expansion and expansion is life, it's growing. Selfishness essentially means that you become smaller and smaller and smaller. Whereas unselfishness means you're growing, becoming bigger and bigger and bigger until you become one with everything that exists. And that oneness has its basis in the reality. In other words, this is the truth. We're all children of God. We're all children of immortal bliss. This is our true nature. This is what we are. This is what each and every other person is. Regardless of how bad they appear to be or how unpleasant, this is within each person, is this divine presence. And the goal, ultimately the solution to all problems, is simply to realize, oh, this is who I am. This is what I am. And then everything else will fall into place. And this is what you'll find out when you separate yourself out from God, and then you struggle with this world. You find all these problems, difficulties, and all kinds of confusions and worries and things come. As you move towards, even in a small degree, you find that what comes is this great sense of security. Things are okay. I'm being taken care of, and I can know what to do. I can handle anything, and just this stability, this sense of strength and fearlessness begins to develop in the person. And so gradually then it evolves into eventually realizing that your true self, your true nature is the only thing that exists. They say that Brahman can't be described and that you can't put into words or express what it actually is, but the closest they come to describing Brahman, the ultimate reality, is Satchit Ananda, existence, consciousness, and bliss. Now all of these we experience. We experience existence, we have a sense of existence, we experience consciousness. We have a sense of being aware of knowing things, and we also experience some happiness, some bliss. But our experience of these things is all relative. As right now we say, I exist. And we say the chair exists, we say stars exist, planets exist, all kinds of things exist. But it's relative. We exist for a certain number of years, and then we don't exist anymore. And then even the stars, they may exist for billions of years, but eventually they come into existence, they exist for a while, and eventually they go out of existence. But Brahman, the ultimate reality, it exists by its very nature, and it can never not exist. And because it exists, everything else exists. In other words, because the ocean is there, you have all the waves and ripples and things in the ocean. But the waves come and go, but the ocean will always be there. So the Brahman, the absolute existence, is like that ocean, is something that's always there, and it can never not exist. In the same way, we have consciousness. We're aware of things, but our consciousness is depending on our particular identity, the experiences we've gone through, the amount of education we have, whatever. So that's our consciousness is limited to our individual consciousness. Whereas the Brahman consciousness, the pure consciousness, is the ultimate reality. That is just consciousness, and that consciousness, as we've been saying, is equally within all things, within all beings, within all things. And this whole universe is an expression of that consciousness. Same way, bliss. We have some sense of happiness in our life. We experience moments of joy. But again, these are very small, limited, and usually they depend on some kind of experience we have. We win the sweepstakes, or we get a new job, or we find a relationship, but something happens, and we say, oh, now I'm happy. But in truth, happiness is something that we are. It's not something that we get. The happiness that we experience when we get certain things fall into place, that very happiness actually is not caused by the experiences that come. It's something happens and we respond from within with happiness. Now, one of the basic spiritual principles is that happiness is not something that you get, but is something that you are. And this is most people in the world, we're searching for something that will make us happy. And people think, oh, money will make me happy, fame will make me happy, particular job or something, this will make me happy, a relationship will make me happy. Like that, we're looking, thinking this is the thing here, this is what's going to give me joy, this is what's going to make me happy. And like that, people are searching all over. When they don't get what they want, they're frustrated, they're unhappy, they're miserable. And if they get what they want, they often find that it doesn't bring them the happiness that they thought it would. In other words, the person who works very hard for $1 million, he gets his $1 million, and he finds out he's not really that happy. He's a millionaire now, but he's not that much happier than before. But the true happiness is something that you find within your own self, because it's bliss and non-bliss is your very nature. It's your nature to be happy, and that's the only place that you'll find happiness, is within yourself. And this is as a person begins to go within, instead of always seeking something outside, trying to grab hold of it in hopes that it'll make it happen, as he begins to look within, he begins to find some happiness there, some peace, some joy, and all. And then you discover that if you are happy, if you found your own kind of inner happiness, then every experience you have is happy. Whereas if your happiness depends on other things, on situation, it goes up and down. Like in relationships. Relationships can bring a great deal of joy at one point. They can also bring a great deal of misery at another point. And so you go up or down. It's like a person wants money. He wants to make lots of money. He invests in the stock market. And so now every time the stocks go up, he's happy. Oh, he's overjoyed. Every time the stocks go down, he's devastated. Swami Bhashan, when he was, the Swami here before, when he was in Nagpur, as a brahmachari, one of his jobs was to go around and collect donations from, this is the Nagpur ashram in India. He'd go around on his bicycle and he'd collect donations from people who would pledge money. And one of the people he met was a billionaire. He owned mines and was extremely rich. So Swami went on his bicycle and went to his house one day. And the servant, answered the door, and he said, oh, you can't see the master now. He's in bed, he's very sick. And so Swami Bhashan asked him, he said, what happened? He said, well, you see, he was worth $2 billion, or 2 billion rupees, but one of his mines fell through, and now he's only worth 1 billion rupees. And he's just laying in bed, totally devastated. I read once that during the Depression, that one of the founders of Eastman Kodak a very, very wealthy person. He committed suicide because his wealth was down to $7 million. His money was down, so he committed suicide. So like that, even if you have your money, it may not bring you the joy and happiness. On the other hand, many, many people have found that when they're young, when they're struggling, when they're hopeful and trying to make a they're happy even though they're in poverty, even though they're struggling along, facing a lot of problems and difficulties, still they have joy. And this is what you want to try to find, is to have joy, and then have that joy, it expresses itself in all of your different experiences as you go through life. As long as your joy, your happiness is depending upon a relationship or a particular job. I mean, so many people, they lose their job and then they're just completely devastated. So like that, as long as your happiness depends on something outside yourself, then eventually disappointment comes. That even if it's a good happiness, you can still lose it. But when you have your happiness inside, as your very kind of nature, then like I said, everything you experience, you go through, it becomes filled with that joy. And then everything becomes joyful. And because it's not depending upon a particular set of circumstances, it's something that you have, and this is your kind of natural state. So this is what we've been studying, the Isha Upanishad. We said we're getting now very close to the end of it. And the basic theme in the Isha Upanishad is that understanding that there's only one thing in existence, only one self, only one being there. And that's who we really are, and only when we know that we're one with God, that God is within us as our very own reality, only then will we kind of find the ultimate thing that everybody is seeking for. We don't realize it. Very few people realize it, but everybody is seeking for God. Everybody has a sense that I'm missing something. There's something lacking. Most people just say, I'm searching for happiness. And they try different things to bring that happiness. But ultimately, this is what we are all seeking for. In the Bible, it tells the story of Adam and Eve. They were in the Garden of Eden, Garden of Paradise. Everything was perfect because they were one with God. They were connected with. But then they ate of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And they separated from God. And because of that, then they got kicked out of the Garden of Paradise, and began wandering around the world. Well, that's where we're in this world which is made up of good and evil, of the pairs of opposites, so happiness and unhappiness. And we're in this world wandering around, searching for something. And not really what we're seeking, really, is to get back home to where we came from, to where we belong. And that home we find in God itself. So this was our study. Then we're going on with the Isha Upanishad. We're getting very near the end of the book right now. Okay, now next, this Sunday, Swami Ishanananda, he's going to speak on why we should meditate. He's going to kind of continuing study of the yoga aphorisms of Patanjali. Then the following Sunday, on July 27th, Swami Aparananda, who's head of the center in Berkeley, he is going to visit us, and he will speak on understanding Swami Vivekananda. And that very same weekend, up at our monastery in Ganges, Michigan, Swami Brahmarupananda, he will do a retreat on Taittiriya Upanishad. So that'll start at 8 o'clock on Friday and end after lunch on Sunday, and it's at our monastery in Ganges, Michigan. Om Asatoma Sagyame Tamasoma Chotirgame Vichurma Amitam Game Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. O Lord, you lead us from the unreal to the real, lead us from darkness to light, and lead us from death to immortality. Peace, peace, peace.